And we are back for episode 4 of our library project that we've been working on. And first and foremost, I want to run all of the tests, and I want to make sure that we are still at green. Remember, we always start at green and we want to end at green. Okay, so now that we have a book and author, the very basic thing that a library needs to do is it needs to be able to check out books. So we have this idea of a checkout, and of course a checkout pertains to a particular book and a user. And on top of that, we need a timestamp of when the book got checked out, and we'll need a timestamp when the book gets returned. Now, based around parameters, we can determine whether that book is late or not, or whether that book may even be lost. We may have to handle a case where the book never is returned. So let's go ahead and start out with the most basic reservation that we can have. So for that, let's make a test. PHP artisan make a test, and we'll call it book reservations test. Let's go back to PHP Storm and take a look at book reservations test. All right, so as always, we'll go ahead and get rid of this test case and start with a fresh test. So what is the very basic thing that we need to do? Well, we need to make sure that whenever a book is checked out, it actually gets the correct timestamp. So we'll start with that. Obviously, we need to build a whole entire world around this first test because there is no model, there is no table, there's nothing for us just yet. So let's start with maybe an experimental test. We may end up changing this a little bit, but we'll say a book can be checked out. Checked out. Very vague, I know, but again, we got to start somewhere. And some of these tests, sometimes you'll find you got to start somewhere and then you make your way into what ends up being the actual test. You might end up dividing one test into 2 or 3 different tests, but at first, you can write everything just in one test and figure out where you want to go. Remember, we're not even sure where we're going with this just yet. No real agenda here. We just want to make the code feel good as we're writing it. So what I'm thinking is this. If I have a book of some sort, I want to be able to call maybe a checkout method on it and maybe pass in the user. So that would be one option. So we have a book and then we can check it out for this user. Alternatively, of course, we can have a user and we can check out the book. So up to you what approach you'd like to take, but obviously ultimately we'll need to use one of these. We either have a book and we check out the user, or we'll have a user and we'll check out the book. Now, we can simplify this a little bit because really we could use the authenticated user to do it. But if we did, and this is why I would encourage you not to use that, instead of grabbing the authenticated user, sometimes we may have a user, which is maybe a librarian, who is able to check out books for another user. So if we lock that into just the authenticated user, then we'll never be able to have a librarian check out a book for somebody else instead of like a self-checkout. So we'll keep that in mind. We do know that that's a functionality we're going to need. So I'm going to go with this approach. I'm going to say if I have a book, I want to check it out for that user. That makes sense to me. So let's get rid of this. And that will also help you not have a user God object. It's very common for the user model to just get everything dumped into it because really a user can do anything in your application. So we can always pivot everything around the user. But get in the habit of pivoting around something else that's not the user. It will help your user model stay nice, lean, and clean. So how do we get a book? Well, let's go ahead and whip up a book using a factory. So we'll say book class. Go ahead and create one for us. And of course, we did import book up here at the top. Now we do know off the bat we need to be able to refresh our database as we've done with all of our tests. We don't need Faker just now. So this book that we created, we need to save to a variable. And that's the variable that we're going to use to do that. Now in the case of the user, of course, we do need a user. So let's also create a factory for a user and go ahead and persist that to the database. Create, there we go. So if we check that out, so if we took our book and we checked it out for that user, what do we expect to see? Well, first and foremost, I expect to see something in some sort of table. So let's assert a count of 1 in maybe the reservations table. How about that? If we call that table reservation, so in the reservation, excuse me, not class, all, if we dumped all of our reservations, then I expect to have 1. Now, furthermore, if I actually grabbed that first record, then I expect maybe the user ID to belong to the user's ID. So let's go ahead and grab the reservation. Doesn't exist yet. We'll grab the first one, and then let's grab the user underscore ID. In the same token, I expect the book ID to also belong to that book, to this book and this user. And we need to assert something on the checked out time. Let's see, assert equals now. Again, if we grab the reservation first, and then let's grab the checked out at. None of this exists. Obviously, this whole code does not exist. Now, one thing here, the way that we wrote this test, is this a feature test or is this a unit test? This is really a unit test, right? Because we're actually grabbing the particular book and we're checking it out. So this would not be considered a feature test. Let me show you the difference. If we go back here and take a look at, for example, the author management test, this test actually hits a particular endpoint with some data, and we're basically simulating the same exact thing that a user would do if they went through our browser, interacted with our website, sent in some data, and then our application did what it had to do. That's a feature test. This here is really a unit test because we are at no point doing anything that a user could do directly. And that's what makes it a unit test. I will want to actually move the book reservation test into my unit directory. And all we'll need to do here is change the namespace from feature to unit. Now, at first, I thought that this was going to be a feature test, and that's why I put it in the features directory. But sometimes, the way the test works itself out, it's not. We will need to write a feature test because we still need to hit a particular endpoint. We need to have that under test, that a user can hit an endpoint with some data. We know it's going to either be the book or the user. And with that data, we need to make sure that our application does the correct thing. So we'll need to go back and do a feature test for this. But for now, this will do for this test. Let's go ahead and run it and let's see what we have. Right off the bat, unable to locate factory for a book. Let's go ahead and make one now. PHP artisan make factory. And before I do that, I do want to show you that you can add the model name right on it. So let's run PHP artisan help make factory. And you do see here you have this -m. So you can pass in the model of the factory that you are creating. So PHP artisan make a factory book factory -m for the model. And of course, it's going to be a book. Whoops, looks like I misspelled artisan. Artisan. There we go. All right, PHP storm book factory. There we go. So now you see that we already have book in here. That's kind of nice. Let's check out the migration for a book so we know what fields we have. So we have a title and we have an author ID. So author ID, we could either pass in a 1 or we can create one on the fly. I'm going to show you two different ways of doing this. Back to my book factory. The first thing is a title. And as you remember, we do have faker. So we could say something like faker, give me a sentence. How about that? Sentence. And then for author ID, well, we could do two things. Yes, we could pass just one. But if we ever needed this to actually belong to a book, this would not work. So another trick that we could do here is one of two things. We can either run a factory right here for an author. We could do that and we could create that. And then we would actually need the ID of it. But here's a trick. The second thing you can actually do is instead of creating it on the fly, if you remove that and just pass in a factory, Laravel is actually going to do a pretty nifty thing for us. And what it's going to do is this. If no author ID is passed in, meaning when we run this right here, when we run the book create, we could pass in an array and say author ID and pass it 1, 2, 3. So if we do that, then Laravel is not going to create an author for us. Now, if we leave it the way it was, like this, without actually passing in an author explicitly, then what it's going to do is actually create one for us. So you may be thinking, well, why does that make a difference? Well, that makes a difference because if we create this right here, then every single time we create a book, an author is going to get created. Even if you manually overrode the author ID, an author still gets created in our database. So it's nice that Laravel knows not to do that if you don't pass in the create. So all we need to do is just pass in a factory. Laravel knows what to do with it. So it's pretty cool. All right, so we have that now. Let's run that test again. Okay, so now we are getting author not found in the factory. Let's go back here. This right here needs to be imported. If you look up here, of course, we do have book, but we don't have author. So let's go ahead and create that now. Book, author. Okay, let's run that test again. Okay, so we're on to the next thing. So unable to locate a factory for an author. Of course, we didn't create that yet. So PHP artisan make a factory for author factory. And of course, our model is author. Great. Back to PHP Storm, author factory. And let's check out the migration to see what we need to do. So create authors table. We need a name and we need a date of birth, but it is nullable. So we'll go ahead and pass one in anyway. So back to author factory, name. We'll use faker again and we'll say give me a name. And then for date of birth, let's use carbon. So we'll say now, let's do some sub years and let's just go back 10 years. That will basically default to today's date 10 years ago. Obviously date of birth, that's just a test dummy data, but we do want to make sure that we do that. Now it's underlining it because it should be sub years. There we go, sub years 10. Okay, back to the test. All right, next, the method checkout doesn't exist on the book. Of course, we know that. All right, let me close everything up. Let's open up our book model and let's create that now. So right under here, path, let's do public checkout. Okay, let's see what we have now. It says reservation not found. So remember, a reservation is a particular reservation and it's a model. We haven't created that just yet. Yet we did reference it in our test. If you remember, back here in our book reservations test, we have this reservation. It's a model, it doesn't exist, so we need to create that now. PHP artisan make model reservation. And of course, we're going to need a migration for that. So we'll go ahead and create one now. Now we can import reservation. So we're going to import that class up here at the top as app reservation. And now I think we'll be okay. Yep, we've moved on to the next error. The next error is that it failed to assert that there was anything in that database at all. And that makes total sense because, well, we're not quite doing anything when we actually hit this checkout. So let's go ahead, and we know we need to accept a user. So let's go back here to book and let's accept that user. Now, yes, you could actually require that to be a user if you wanted to. So it depends on how strict you want to be. So what this will do in PHP is it would make sure that this object of user is always of type user. This will help you basically lock down your application so that you can't accidentally pass in a book to your checkout, for example, or something like that. It's up to you how strict you want to be. We're going to keep it simple. We're just going to keep it open. And we're going to hope that our tests will protect us from doing something like that. And a lot of times there's a lot to be said about just keeping it simple until it needs to be more complicated. Keep your code as simple as possible. Make it work. And when the time comes, if required, you can go ahead and make that refactor. I doubt you're going to run into that issue though, because if your tests are green or passing or testing your code and you got good coverage, there's no reason why you should be passing a book to your checkout method. So that should not be a concern. So once we have our book and we have our checkout, what do we expect here? Well, at some point, we're going to have to create a reservation. So we'll have to somehow create a reservation. And we know that the reservation is going to need a checked out at. And checked out at is going to be now. We know that. What else is it going to need? Well, it's going to need a user ID. And we'll set that equal to user ID. And that's about it. But it does need a book ID. So what we could do, of course, as we've done before, is we can create a relationship for this. So instead of calling it on the reservation directly, why don't we actually use this reservations? And then on that, let's go ahead and call create. Now we do need parentheses on this. So this reservations is referring to a relationship that doesn't exist yet. And we are creating on that relationship. So let's run our test, and I bet you we're going to get an error about that. And sure enough, we say, well, there is no reservations in our book. Okay, let's go ahead and create that now. So right down here, we'll say new public function, reservations. And what is this? What kind of relationship is a book to a reservation? Well, a book can have many reservations, and a reservation belongs to a book. It also belongs to a user, so we'll have to create that as well. So let's return this has many. What does it have many of? It has many reservations. Class, and that's it. So now this is a relationship where this has many reservations, and this being, of course, our book, because we are inside our book model. Let's go back to this test. Let's run it again. And now we get a mass assignment exception. It's saying user ID is not fillable in reservations. We know that. So let's go ahead and go back to PHP Storm. And in our reservation model, as we've done before, let's turn off this fillable protection that we have by setting guarded array equal to an empty array. So this basically turns off mass assignment protection. We know that. All right. So up next, of course, this database doesn't contain a column by user ID. So let's go back to the create reservations table. And let's start with that user ID. So table unsigned big integer for user ID. Let's run our test again. So now we don't have a checked out at. Let's go ahead and copy that. Let's create a new one for table timestamp for checked out at. Now we don't have a book ID. Let's copy that. We can put that right here. Okay. And there we go. We are green. So we went through all of the steps and we got through to creating a reservation. So now we know that we have the logic to prove that a book can have a reservation. And if we check out a book, then of course we do in fact create a reservation in our database. Awesome. All right, how about this? Let's create the inverse of that. So let's pretend that the book got checked out, but then it got checked back in. So now we need to know that it got checked in at is not nullable. So let's create a new test and say a book can be returned. How about that? Obviously, if it could be checked out, then it needs to be returned. Let's copy some of this code right here. So we'll still have a user, we'll still have a book. Then we'll say book maybe return, or we can keep it in the same and say check in instead. I do like that. Let's go ahead and check in the book for that user. Do we need a user? Not really. I'm not really either concerned on who returns the book as much as the fact that I just want the book to be returned. So if the book is returned, so yes, our reservation should still only contain one. And of course, remember, a reservation will have a checked out time, but then we're going to add this new checked in time. So then we really don't need to assert that the book ID and the user ID are still there, but I'm going to do it anyway, just in terms to make sure that our code doesn't accidentally override the book or the user ID. And then I want to make sure that checked in at is right now. Okay, but here's the thing. This book was never checked out. So this should almost throw an exception. And we'll get to that in just a second. We'll write another test for that, because if a book is not checked out, then there should be an exception, right? So we'll write another test for that in just a second, but we still need to check out this book. Before we can check it in, we need to check it out. So we'll create a book, we'll create a user, then we'll take that book and check out that book by that user. Then we'll take our book again and make sure that we check that in. Then we're going to make 4 assertions. We're going to make sure that we still only have one reservation, not 2. There should only be 1. And then we need to make sure that our user ID still matches with our reservation and our book ID still matches with our reservation. And then finally, that we have a checked in at time. And it's just going to be a timestamp of when the book got returned. Great. Let's go ahead and run this test and see how we can make that work. So first and foremost, check in. That doesn't exist in the book. Let's go to book. And right underneath checkout, let's add check in. Okay. Now, of course, we're going to get something about nothing matching because null does not match the expected object. That's line 41. Let's go back to our test. This all passed, right? But this did not pass because checked in at is actually not even set. If you wanted to get a particular error on that, we could say assert not null on that particular field. We could take this first, and we want to make sure that that's not null. And I bet you now we're going to get something different. And we do. So we failed asserting that null is not null. Of course, null is null. So back here, what do we need to do here? So the first thing we need to do is actually match up our book reservation. So it turns out we are going to need the user ID after all, because we need to be able to match up to any reservations that are in our database. Let's actually accept the user and pass in the user through the check-in method. So now that we have that, let's go in here and say, all right, so this reservations, go ahead and give me one where the user ID matches the user ID that was passed in, but we also need to make sure that it's not null, meaning it is checked out. And how do we check if a book is checked out? Well, if it's checked out, it means that the checked out time is not null. So if it's not null, then the book is checked out. Checked out at is not null. And then go ahead and give me the first one. We should probably also check that the checked in time is null. So we'll also check that. So here it is. So we're grabbing our reservations, but then we're going to scope it to just the ones where the user ID matches the user ID. Then we're going to make sure that checked out at is not null, meaning the book was checked out, but at the same time the checked in at is null. And then we're going to grab the first one. Now another little test that we need to make sure is that a user can check out a book twice. So a user can check out a book twice. It's another little test we need to run because we need to make sure that our user, if they check out a book and check it back in, that they're able to check it out again and check it back in without it interfering with each other. So these are the little cases that you're going to see that we're going to add on tests for to make sure that our code is doing everything that it's supposed to be doing. So now this is going to give us our reservation. So let's go ahead and save that. And then on our reservation, what I want to do is the following. So reservation, I want to update. What do I want to update? I want to update the checked in at and set that equal to now. Because of course we are checking in this book. Okay, let's run our test. So now there's an update on null. So we were not able to fetch this correctly. And the reason for that is because this checked in at doesn't exist. Let's go ahead and add that to the create reservations table. Let's add another one for checked in at. Now checked in at needs to be nullable. And the reason for that is because remember, whenever you check out a book, of course, the checked in at is still going to be null. Otherwise, you wouldn't know exactly when it's going to get checked in at. So it definitely needs to be null. Let's run that test again, and we're back to green. Awesome. If we run our entire suite, we're still at green. So we're doing great. Let's tackle those two edge cases that we just talked about. Let's start with this one. So a user can check out a book twice. All right, let's turn that into a test. A user can check out a book twice. Let's go ahead and steal some of this setup from up here. You know what? We'll steal everything. All right, so we're going to go ahead and create a book. Then we're going to create a user. Then we're going to check out that book. Then we're going to check it back in. But then I'm going to check it out again. So that's the action that we are checking. So if we did this, and then we checked it out, and then we checked it in, and then we checked it out again, meaning the user returned the book. Obviously, we're doing this in a matter of seconds, but a person checks out a book, takes it for a week, brings it back. 3 months later, they come back and try to check out the same book. We still want to be able to do that. So at this point, we assert that we have how many reservations? Well, at this point, we should have had 2 reservations because this is 1, and then this should have started a brand new reservation. Now, of course, the reservation we can no longer use first because, of course, the first one is going to be referring to this initial reservation. What we really need is to just go ahead and switch this over to find. And let's find it with the ID of 2, meaning the second time that the reservation got created. We know that the first time it got created, everything should be okay. So at this stage, we'll make sure that our user ID on that reservation is correct. We'll make sure that the book ID on that book is correct. And then at that stage, we do need to check that it is null at the checked in at, right? Because at this stage, it is null because we have not checked it back in just yet. And of course, we want to make sure that not the checked in at, but the checked out at is equal to now. Now, if we want to test a little bit further, then we can check in the book And then at this stage, we could do a couple more checks. So we're still going to grab a lot of this code here. So at this stage, we still expect to have 2 reservations in our database. We still expect the user and book ID to be correct, but we expect not null on the checked in at, and we expect the checked in at to also be filled out. So this is a pretty long test, but I think it proves what it needs to do. So let me run this test and let's see what we get. We get green. So we are actually good to go. We are still making sure that that is happening. So now check this out. How can we break this test? If we go to the book model and we actually did not have this line right here, if I got rid of that line, I think that will break that test. And it does. So that line that we added right there is the line that requires that when we are fetching the correct reservation, we need to make sure that the checked in at is null. Otherwise, it may be an old reservation. So if we run that test with the line back in, then we do get green. And if we run the full suite, then we are good to go. Okay, so let's go back here and let's tackle this other edge case. So if it's not checked out, then there should be an exception. So let's turn that into a test. If not checked out, exception is thrown. All right, so let's copy some of the setup over here. We're going to create a book and we're going to create that. And if we try to check in that book without checking it out, then we do expect an exception. So to expect an exception, we can say this, expect an exception. And for now, let's go ahead and just expect a regular exception. Nothing fancy. We may at some point create our own exception, saying something like book is not checked out exception. For now, let's just throw a regular exception. No problems there. All right, let's go ahead and do that now. Let's run the test. And of course, we blow up because we're getting called to a member function update on null. So what is actually happening? And I'll tell you what is actually happening. Let's go ahead and die and dump reservation right here. Let's check out what happens. So we get null. So that's just it. We are still trying to fetch a reservation because we're checked in, but turns out it's null because we never checked it out. So we never created a reservation for this book and this user. So this is null. So we could do a quick check here. Many ways we can tackle this as always, but we could say if is null reservation, then let's go ahead and throw a new exception. Like I said, we're just tackling a regular run-of-the-mill exception, nothing crazy. Let's run that test now, and now we're back to green. Run our full suite, we're still at green. Does that make sense? Again, we don't want somebody to be able to check in a book if they've never checked it out. That is just not normal operation for a library. That's an exception kind of thing. If I tried to check in a book and it was never checked out, then clearly something went wrong along the way during the checkout process. So we'll throw an exception for that. So this is the unit test for this entire thing. We do need to create some endpoints to make this logic be activated through the browser. So in the next episode, let's shift our focus into a feature test as opposed to a unit test, so we can create the necessary endpoints to check out and check in books. So go ahead and apply these changes to your project, and then when you're ready, let's move on to that feature test.